The deputy's cruiser rolled onto the marina gravel just as I slipped a lock through the dock chain and closed Old Lake's main gate. Karen Mitchell stood beside the boat slips and shouted that I was blocking HOA property, while residents crowded the shoreline with coolers, life jackets, and pontoon keys in their hands. My lake, my gate, my marina channel. Behind her, 20 boats sat trapped against the floating docks, and the neighborhood's summer regatta stalled before a single engine started. What Karen did not know was that I controlled the marina entrance, the access channel, the shoreline permit file, and the old federal waterway corridor running beneath her entire dock system. Then the 911 dispatcher's voice crackled from the deputy's radio, and everyone went quiet. The lake wind came in cold across the water. It smelled like algae, gasoline, wet rope, and old cedar planks baking in the sun. Aluminum masts clinked softly against cables. Red and blue lights flashed across the marina roof. Karen pointed at the lock like it was evidence against me. That was her first mistake. She thought a local trespass call could erase a federal filing. My name is Ryan Mercer. I am 41 years old, and 5 days earlier I bought Old Lake from a timber estate that had been selling off forgotten water parcels outside Madison County, Alabama. It was supposed to be simple. 90 acres of water, a collapsed mill house, a narrow spillway, 2 miles of pine shoreline, one private marina structure nobody could clearly explain. The closing packet called it Historic Water Access Improvements. That phrase stayed with me. Historic usually means expensive. Improvements usually means somebody skipped paperwork. I came to inspect the marina after finding fresh HOA signs bolted to my dock posts. Willow Ridge residents only. No public access. Private club marina. The signs were new. The dock pilings were not. Some were weathered gray. Some leaned slightly toward the channel. A faded number had been carved into one piling near the fuel shed. It did not match any HOA marking. It matched a symbol on an old navigation map I found folded inside the estate file. I had not understood it. Yet, I only knew it did not belong to them. Karen arrived before I finished securing the gate. White SUV, navy blazer, sunglasses polished enough to reflect the whole shoreline. She walked past the posted notice without reading it. She said I had no authority to interfere with community water access. I told her I owned the lake. She laughed once. Quiet. Sharp. Then she called 911 and told the dispatcher a stranger was trying to seize the marina. By the time the deputy stepped onto the dock, the crowd had grown restless. A man in deck shoes kept asking if he could move his pontoon. A teenager filmed from the grass. A woman near the launch ramp whispered that her family paid extra dues for lake rights. Karen kept repeating the same phrase. HOA Marina. HOA Marina. HOA Marina. I handed the deputy my deed, shoreline survey, and the old map from the estate box. The paper fluttered in the wind. He checked the parcel number first, then the gate post, then the dock permit plate bolted beside the office door. His expression changed before he spoke. Karen saw it. So did I? The deputy looked back at the marina, then at the old navigation symbol printed near the channel line. Ma'am, he said slowly, this may involve more than HOA access. The dock creaked beneath us. Then an older man in the crowd stepped forward and stared at the map. The older man pushed through the crowd and stopped beside the deputy without taking his eyes off the map. The wind rattled the aluminum dock cleats behind us. Water slapped softly against the floating slips. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then the man pointed directly at the faded symbol near the channel line. Where did you get this copy? He asked. His voice was calm, but something about it made Karen stop talking. I told him it came from the estate records included with the purchase. He reached for the map carefully, not like a curious resident, like someone recognizing an old friend. Minnie Hook. The deputy watched him study every corner of the page. Karen folded her arms and demanded to know why everyone was suddenly treating a piece of paper like it mattered. The man ignored her. He traced the channel with one finger. Then he looked toward the marina stretching into the lake. The expression on his face changed. That got my attention. This is older than the marina, he said quietly. A few residents exchanged confused looks. Another hook. The smell of fuel drifted from the dockside pump station. A pontoon rocked against its mooring lines. Somewhere across the water, a gull cried out. The older man finally introduced himself. Walter Hayes, retired hydraulic engineer. 36 years working federal water projects across 3 states. Karen immediately dismissed him. She called him a retired bureaucrat. Walter did not react. He kept staring at the map. The deputy asked if the symbol meant anything important. Walter answered without hesitation. Possibly. That single word made the crowd even quieter. Minnie Hook. Karen stepped closer and insisted the marina had belonged to the community for years. Walter nodded politely. Then he asked a simple question. Do you have the original marina permit file? Karen blinked. No answer. He asked again. Still nothing. Several residents looked toward her. The deputy noticed it too. Walter then asked whether the dock expansion permits were included with the HOA records. Again, silence. The confidence that filled the shoreline 10 minutes earlier was beginning to fade. Another hook. I could see Karen trying to regain control of the conversation. She started talking about dues, maintenance fees, and community traditions. Walter listened patiently. Then he pointed toward the end of the marina. That section looks newer than the rest. Everyone turned to look. He was right. The outer slips used brighter materials. Newer decking. Different flotation units. Even the bolts reflected sunlight differently. Walter asked when the extension was added. Nobody seemed completely sure. The answers varied. 5 years. 7 years. 10 years. That inconsistency lingered in the air. Minnie Hook. The deputy wrote notes in a small pad. His posture had changed. Earlier he arrived expecting a simple property dispute. Now he looked like someone trying to understand a much larger situation. Walter carefully rolled the map closed and handed it back to me. Then he asked whether I had seen the rest of the estate archive. I told him I had only reviewed a portion of it. Several boxes remained unopened in a storage unit near the county line. His eyes narrowed immediately. Do not throw anything away, he said. Not one page. The seriousness in his voice caught everyone off guard. Another hook. Karen tried once more to pressure the deputy into ordering the gate reopened. The deputy declined. He explained that ownership documentation appeared valid and that the matter involved questions beyond a routine trespass complaint. Karen did not like that answer. Neither did several board members standing behind her. Their frustration was obvious. Yet none of them produced a single permit, survey, or original marina record. Walter noticed that too. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, he handed me a business card worn soft at the edges. On the back, he wrote the name of a federal archive facility nearly 60 miles away. Then he circled it twice. The look he gave me suggested the map was only the beginning. He noticed something else before leaving. The parking lot emptied slowly after Walter left, but his final glance stayed with me. The afternoon sun hung low above the water. Long shadows stretched across the marina decking. The smell of lake water and treated lumber lingered in the warm air. I locked the gate again and watched the last boat owner drive away. Most people looked confused now. Not angry. Confused. Minnie Hook. Karen remained near the marina office with 2 board members. They stood close together, speaking in low voices. Every few seconds one of them looked toward me. The confidence from earlier was fading. That mattered. People only whisper when certainty begins to crack. I loaded the estate records back into my truck and headed toward the storage unit Walter mentioned. The facility sat 23 miles away beside an old highway lined with pine trees and abandoned farm buildings. The drive took less than 40 minutes. The entire time, one question kept returning. What had Walter noticed? Another hook. The storage unit smelled like dust, cardboard, and hot metal when I rolled the door open. Sunlight spilled across stacked boxes, marked with estate inventory numbers. Most contained ordinary property records, tax statements, maintenance reports, insurance files. Then I found 3 boxes labeled Water Assets Division. The wording immediately caught my attention. I carried them outside where the light was better. Inside were maps, engineering sketches, inspection notes, and correspondence dating back decades. Minnie Hook. One folder contained photographs of the lake taken long before the marina existed. Another showed shoreline markers that no longer appeared on modern maps. I spread everything across a folding table. Wind rustled the pages. Birds chirped from nearby utility lines. The deeper I looked, the stranger the collection became. Several documents referenced navigation maintenance. Others mentioned channel preservation. Those phrases did not fit a private recreational lake. Not at all. Another hook. About an hour later, I found a folded blueprint tucked inside a damaged envelope. The paper was yellow with age. Its corners were brittle. Across the center ran a bold line cutting directly through the current marina location. Beside it sat the same symbol Walter recognized near the shoreline. There it was again, larger this time, more detailed. I stared at it for several seconds. Somebody wanted that symbol documented repeatedly. The question was why? Mini hook. My phone rang. Walter. I answered immediately. He asked whether I had located the archive boxes. I told him about the blueprint. Silence followed. Then I heard papers moving on his end of the line. Check the lower right corner, he said. I turned the document. There was a faded stamp partially obscured by water damage. Most of the ink had disappeared. One line remained readable. Federal Navigation Review. My pulse quickened. Walter became very quiet. That concerned me more than anything he could have said. Another hook. He asked me to send photographs immediately. 10 minutes later, he called back. His voice sounded different. More focused. More serious. He explained that the symbol was not associated with local property management. It appeared on older water control and navigation records. He was careful with every word. He still did not know exactly what we were looking at, but he knew enough to be concerned. Then he asked a second question. Had anyone ever shown me the original marina construction permit? I realized nobody had. Not Karen. Not the board. Not the estate attorneys. Nobody. The realization settled heavily. Mini hook. As the sun dropped lower behind the trees, I continued sorting through the boxes. Near the bottom of the final container, I found a narrow file wrapped in faded blue ribbon. Unlike everything else, it carried no estate inventory number. Only a handwritten note. The handwriting had almost disappeared with age. Yet 2 words remained perfectly visible. Restricted channel. Something inside that file changed everything. The blue ribbon came apart the moment I loosened the knot. Dry paper crackled in the evening air. The sun sat low behind the storage units, casting long orange shadows across the asphalt. I opened the file carefully. Inside were fewer than 20 pages. Yet within seconds I understood why somebody separated them from everything else. Mini hook. The first document was not a permit. It was not a survey either. It was a routing diagram. Thick black lines traced a narrow corridor through the center of the lake. Several technical notes ran along the margins. Most were faded beyond recognition. One notation remained clear. Protected navigation route. I read it twice. Then a third time. The marina sat directly across that corridor. Another hook. A freight train horn echoed somewhere beyond the trees. Warm air moved across the open storage lot. I pulled out the next page. It contained correspondence between engineers discussing maintenance responsibilities. The dates stretched back decades. Some signatures had disappeared under water stains. Others remained perfectly visible. What caught my attention was the repeated reference to federal review requirements. The phrase appeared again and again. Whoever assembled this file wanted future owners to notice it. Mini hook. I photographed every page and sent them to Walter. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang. He did not waste time. Do not share those documents yet, he said. His voice sounded sharper than before. I need to verify something first. Papers shuffled in the background. I heard keyboard clicks, then silence. Walter rarely sounded uncertain. That alone told me the discovery mattered. Another hook. I loaded the boxes into my truck and started toward town. The sky had darkened into deep blue by the time I reached the lake. Lights glowed across the shoreline. Several boats remained tied to the marina slips. Karen's SUV was parked near the office building. So were 2 other board member vehicles. They were meeting after hours. I stayed back and watched from the access road. Through the office windows, I could see people moving around a conference table. Maps covered the surface. Something had changed. They were worried now. Mini hook. The next morning began before sunrise. Mist floated across the lake. Water birds skimmed the surface. The marina looked peaceful from a distance. Up close, the tension remained. New notices had appeared on bulletin boards near the launch ramp. HOA emergency meeting. Community water access rights. The wording felt rushed. Defensive. Residents stopped to read them while drinking coffee from travel mugs. Several glanced toward the locked gate. Rumors were spreading faster than facts. Another hook. Walter arrived shortly after 8 o'clock carrying a weathered leather case. He walked directly to the shoreline without greeting anyone. The lake reflected pale morning light behind him. I handed him copies of the file. He reviewed the routing diagram first. Then he compared it against the estate map. Finally, he opened a binder from his case. The pages inside were covered with engineering symbols. His eyes narrowed. "There it is," he said quietly. I followed his finger across the page. The same corridor appeared again. Same location. Same alignment. Same channel. Mini hook. Walter explained only part of what he found. He still wanted confirmation. He believed the symbol represented a designated navigation route tied to an older federal water management system. If true, local assumptions meant very little. The implications extended far beyond HOA rules, far beyond Marina fees, even beyond county records. For the first time, the conflict seemed connected to a larger network nobody in the neighborhood understood. Another hook. Before he could continue, a white government pickup truck rolled slowly into the Marina parking lot. Neither of us recognized the seal on the door. The white pickup rolled to a stop beside the Marina office and shut off its engine. The morning air felt cool against the water. Mist still drifted above the lake surface. Every conversation near the shoreline seemed to pause at once. Walter lowered his binder. I looked toward the door seal on the truck again. It was not county government, not state government either. That alone changed the atmosphere. Mini hook. A man in a gray field jacket stepped out carrying a clipboard tube under one arm. He looked around the marina slowly before speaking to anyone. His attention lingered on the outer dock extensions. Then he studied the channel itself. Not the boats. Not the residents. The channel. Walter noticed the same thing immediately. "Interesting," he muttered. Another hook. Karen emerged from the marina office less than a minute later. Her expression brightened when she saw an official vehicle. She walked across the parking lot with confidence returning to her stride. Several board members followed behind her. They clearly believed help had arrived. The field officer introduced himself politely and asked a simple question. Who currently owned the lake parcel? Karen started answering before I could speak. He stopped her. Then he asked again. I handed him a copy of the recorded deed. He reviewed it carefully. Karen did not look pleased. Mini hook. The breeze carried the smell of wet cedar from the docks. Metal rigging tapped softly against boat rails. Residents gathered near the bulletin board pretending not to listen. Everyone was listening. The officer continued asking questions. Ownership boundaries. Shoreline access points. Maintenance history. Dock expansion dates. Karen answered some. Avoided others. Walter quietly watched the exchange. I could tell he was measuring every response. Another hook. Then the officer asked for the marina permit file. The question landed harder than anything before it. Karen froze for half. A second. Small. Brief. But noticeable. One board member looked toward another. Nobody moved. Nobody produced paperwork. The silence stretched long enough for residents nearby to notice. Walter folded his arms. The officer wrote something on his clipboard. Mini hook. Finally, Karen explained that records were stored by previous boards over many years. Some files were digital. Others were archived. The explanation sounded reasonable at first. Then the officer asked for the permit number itself. Again, nobody answered. The marina suddenly looked different to me. Less like a community landmark. More like a structure carrying unanswered questions. Another hook. Walter eventually stepped forward and requested permission to show several historic diagrams. The officer agreed. Together they spread the maps across the hood of my truck. Wind tugged gently at the paper corners. The officer studied the navigation corridor markings for several minutes. He traced the route through the center of the lake. Then he compared it against a recent aerial image from his own folder. His eyebrows lifted slightly. That reaction did not escape Karen. Mini hook. For the first time, the officer walked the length of the marina. He stopped repeatedly to inspect piling locations and dock alignments. Several measurements appeared to interest him. He photographed marker posts near the outer slips. Then he examined the channel entrance itself. The deeper he looked, the less he spoke. That worried Karen far more than open disagreement would have. Another hook. By midday, the sun reflected brightly off the water. Heat shimmered above the parking lot. Residents continued arriving to watch. Rumors spread across the neighborhood faster than facts. Some believed the marina would close. Others thought the HOA would win immediately. Neither side understood what was actually happening. Walter did. His focus never left the maps. Then the officer returned from the shoreline carrying a weathered metal marker plate covered in mud residue. He held it beside the old routing diagram. The numbers matched exactly. Walter looked directly at me. Ryan, he said quietly, this corridor was never abandoned. The Officer's next phone call confirmed something even bigger. The officer stepped away from the crowd to take the call near the shoreline markers. The lake breeze carried fragments of his conversation across the water. Not enough to understand. Just enough to know the discussion was serious. Walter remained beside the truck, studying the maps. Karen paced near the Marina office. Her board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Nobody seemed eager to speak anymore. Minnie Hook. The afternoon sun reflected off hundreds of small ripples moving across the channel. Boat owners stood near the slips watching every movement. The marina no longer felt like a neighborhood gathering place. It felt like the center of an investigation. That shift was impossible to ignore. Another hook. When the officer finally returned, his expression had changed. He immediately requested additional photographs of the shoreline corridor. Then he asked for aerial images dating back at least 15 years. Karen questioned why such old records mattered. He did not answer directly. Instead, he asked another question. Had the marina expansion ever undergone a navigation impact review? The silence returned. This time it lasted even longer. Minnie Hook. Walter opened his binder again and carefully laid several diagrams across the truck hood. The officer compared them to the aerial photographs. Together, they traced the corridor through the lake. Every line pointed toward the same problem. The outer marina slips extended deeper into the channel than anyone realized. The farther they measured, the worse it looked. Another hook. Karen attempted to redirect the discussion toward community ownership. She talked about dues, maintenance budgets, volunteer work, annual boating events. Nobody interrupted her. But nobody changed course either. The officer remained focused on physical measurements. Walter remained focused on records. Facts were beginning to outweigh assumptions. That made the atmosphere noticeably heavier. Minnie Hook. By mid-afternoon, a second vehicle arrived carrying survey equipment. Residents immediately noticed. Tripods emerged from the back compartment. Measuring poles followed. Several people started taking photographs with their phones. Rumors spread across the parking lot within minutes. Some believed new permits were being issued. Others feared permits might disappear. Neither group knew the truth. Another hook. The survey crew moved methodically along the shoreline. Metal stakes marked reference points. Laser instruments captured elevation data. Every measurement centered on the corridor identified in the historic records. Not the entire lake. Not the entire marina. Just the corridor. That detail mattered. Walter quietly explained why. If the protected route remained active, then its boundaries controlled everything built within it. The implications stretched far beyond HOA authority. Minnie Hook. Clouds drifted across the sun late in the afternoon. Shadows moved over the water. The survey team reached the outermost dock extension and stopped. One technician checked the readings twice. Then a third time. He called the officer over. They reviewed the data together. Even from a distance, I could tell the numbers were not what they expected. Another hook. Karen walked toward them immediately. The officer spoke with her privately for several minutes. I could not hear the conversation. I did not need to. Her posture changed. Her shoulders stiffened. Her arms crossed tightly. For the first time since this began, she looked genuinely concerned. Residents noticed it too. The crowd became unusually quiet. Minnie Hook. Walter stood beside me watching the scene unfold. The smell of warm pine drifted from the hills surrounding the lake. Water tapped rhythmically against the dock floats. Then he pointed toward a location near the marina fuel station. A small marker post leaned partially beneath the surface. I had barely noticed it before. Walter had. He asked whether anyone had ever inspected it. Nobody had. Not that I knew of. Another hook. As sunset approached, the survey crew completed its final measurements and packed their equipment. Before leaving, the officer handed me a card with a case reference number written across the back. Then he looked directly at Walter. "Your records were accurate," he said. Walter nodded once. The officer paused before adding something else. According to preliminary measurements, part of the marina appeared to sit directly inside the protected corridor. Then he mentioned one document nobody had been able to locate. The officer's final comment stayed with me long after the survey crew left. One document. That was all he mentioned. One missing document nobody could locate. The sun disappeared behind the tree line as the lake turned dark blue beneath the evening sky. Dock lights flickered on across the marina. Reflections stretched across the water like thin ribbons of gold. Walter remained beside the shoreline, studying copies of the records. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Minnie Hook. Finally, I asked what kind of document could matter enough to change everything. Walter closed his binder slowly. The original authorization file, he said. If it exists, it tells us exactly what was approved and what was never approved. That answer immediately raised another question. If the file was so important, why could nobody find it? Another hook. The next morning brought a different atmosphere. News had spread throughout the neighborhood overnight. Small groups gathered near mailboxes and walking paths discussing the survey results. Some residents blamed the HOA board. Others blamed me for creating problems where none existed before. A few simply wanted answers. The uncertainty was growing faster than the facts. Minnie Hook. Karen responded by calling an emergency community meeting inside the Marina clubhouse. Every chair was occupied before the meeting even began. Ceiling fans hummed overhead. Coffee cups lined the tables. The smell of old carpet mixed with lake air drifting through the open doors. I attended quietly and sat near the back. Walter joined me a few minutes later. Several heads turned when he entered the room. People recognized him now. Another hook. Karen opened the meeting with confidence, but it felt forced. She insisted the marina belonged to the community. She described decades of uninterrupted use. She emphasized tradition, history, shared investment. Residents listened carefully. Then someone asked whether the HOA possessed the original marina authorization file. The room became still. Karen answered that records were being reviewed. The response satisfied almost nobody. Minnie Hook. Another resident stood and asked about the protected corridor. A second asked about the survey markers. A third asked why government officials were measuring docks in the first place. The questions arrived faster than answers. Karen attempted to maintain control, but the meeting had shifted. People wanted evidence now, not assurances. Another hook. Walter never interrupted. He simply observed. Every so often he wrote notes inside a small notebook. His calmness contrasted sharply with the tension filling the room. Then he leaned toward me and pointed through the clubhouse windows. Outside, near the fuel station, a maintenance worker was examining the partially submerged marker post discovered the previous day. Walter watched him closely. So did I. Minnie Hook. After the meeting ended, we walked toward the shoreline. Wind pushed small waves against the dock floats. The maintenance worker had already left. The marker remained in place. Walter knelt beside it and brushed away additional mud. More numbers appeared beneath the surface. Not random numbers. Reference coordinates. His expression changed immediately. Another hook. We compared the coordinates against the routing diagram from the blue ribbon file. They matched perfectly. The marker was not decorative. It was part of the original corridor system. Walter photographed everything. Then he called a former colleague who specialized in historic infrastructure records. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. When he ended the call, he looked more focused than ever. Minnie Hook. His colleague remembered something unusual. Decades earlier, several Waterway records had been transferred from regional storage facilities into a centralized archive. Most were digitized. A few were not. One category required special handling because of navigation authority concerns. Walter believed our missing file might belong to that category. If he was right, the document was never lost. It had simply been moved somewhere nobody in the HOA thought to check. Another hook. By late afternoon, we were already preparing archive requests. The process would take time. Days, possibly longer. Yet the situation around the marina continued changing. Residents were demanding transparency. Officials were reviewing measurements. Questions multiplied every hour. Then Walter received an email containing an archive index number he had not expected to find. Walter stared at the email for several seconds before saying a word. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the windshield of my truck. Wind moved gently through the pine trees surrounding the lake. Somewhere near the marina, a boat engine started and then shut off again. Everything felt strangely quiet. Minnie Hook. He turned the laptop toward me. An archive index number sat at the center of the screen. Below it was a reference description. Federal Navigation Corridor Authorization Package. Neither of us spoke immediately. We had spent days searching for a missing file. Now we had proof it existed. Another hook. Walter explained that archive indexes were not assigned casually. Entire categories of records could disappear over time. Storage facilities changed. Agencies reorganized. Paperwork moved between departments. But index numbers remained. They acted like footprints. If the number existed, the file existed somewhere too. That realization changed everything. Mini hook. We spent the next hour contacting archive personnel. The process moved slowly. Transfer requests, verification forms, reference confirmations, the kind of bureaucracy most people hate. Yet every response brought us closer. Each email confirmed another piece of the puzzle. The file had not been destroyed. It had not been lost. It had simply been sitting in a different system. Another hook. Meanwhile, the situation around the marina continued evolving. Residents were talking openly now. Walking groups stopped near the shoreline to discuss the survey. Fishermen compared rumors at the launch ramp. Parents spoke about the emergency meeting while watching their children near the water. The uncertainty affected everyone. That was becoming impossible to ignore. Mini hook. Karen responded by increasing communication. New notices appeared across the neighborhood. Community updates, legal reviews, statements from the board. The language sounded confident, but it lacked specifics. People noticed. Residents had started asking for documents rather than reassurances. The difference mattered. Another hook. 2 days later, a response finally arrived from the archive office. The requested file had been located. Not digitally, physically, stored within a protected collection requiring special retrieval procedures. Walter read the email twice, then a third time. The retrieval process would take additional time, but confirmation alone represented a major breakthrough. Mini hook. The weather shifted overnight. Heavy clouds rolled across the region. Rain tapped against the marina roofs the next morning. Water dripped from dock railings. The lake's surface darkened beneath the overcast sky. I met Walter inside a small diner overlooking the highway. Coffee steamed between us as we reviewed everything collected so far. Maps, surveys, coordinates, historic photographs. Every piece pointed toward the same conclusion. Another hook. Walter spread several diagrams across the table. One image showed the protected corridor decades earlier. Another showed the modern marina layout. The overlap was impossible to miss. Large sections of the dock system extended directly across the route. The visual comparison made the issue easier to understand than any technical explanation. Mini hook. Halfway through breakfast, Walter received another call. This one came from a former federal records specialist he trusted. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Yet when he ended the call, his expression changed immediately. He looked almost surprised. That rarely happened. Another hook. The specialist had located a secondary reference connected to the authorization package. Not the main file. A supplemental review record. According to the archive notes, inspectors revisited the corridor years after the original approval. That meant the route remained relevant long after construction began around the lake. The implications were significant. If later reviews existed, then oversight never completely disappeared. Mini hook. Rain continued falling as we drove back toward the shoreline. The marina looked different beneath gray skies. Quieter, more isolated. Karen stood near the office speaking with several board members. Their conversation stopped when they saw us arrive. Nobody waved. Nobody approached. Tension now hung over the property like the storm clouds above it. Another hook. Late that afternoon, an email attachment finally arrived from the archive system. It contained only a cover sheet, not the full authorization package, just the first page. Yet one sentence near the bottom immediately caught Walter's attention. He pointed at it without saying a word. The corridor carried a status designation nobody expected to see. Walter kept staring at the sentence for several seconds. Rain tapped steadily against the marina office windows. The lake beyond the glass looked dark and restless beneath the gray afternoon sky. I leaned closer to read the designation myself. The wording was short, simple, yet its significance was enormous. The corridor was listed as active under continuing navigation protection status. Mini hook. Neither of us expected that language. We expected historical references, archived oversight, maybe old restrictions that faded over time. Not active status. Active changed everything. Active meant the corridor never officially disappeared. Active meant later reviews suddenly made sense. Active meant every measurement taken during the past week mattered even more. Another hook. Walter immediately contacted the archive office for clarification. The response arrived the following morning. The designation was authentic. No clerical error. No outdated database issue. The corridor remained recognized within the system. The exact scope still required review, but the status itself was valid. Walter read the confirmation twice before forwarding it to me. Mini hook. Word spread faster than expected. Somebody inside the review process shared information with local officials. Then local officials spoke with residents. Soon everyone seemed to know something important had surfaced. Nobody knew the details. They only knew the investigation had become more serious. Conversations around the lake changed overnight. Another hook. The marina parking lot remained busy throughout the weekend. Residents gathered in small groups discussing theories. Some believed the HOA board had unknowingly inherited a problem from previous leadership. Others suspected critical paperwork had been ignored years ago. Several people simply wanted access to their boats restored without further complications. The uncertainty touched nearly every household. Mini hook. Karen appeared less frequently in public now. When she did appear, she moved quickly between meetings and phone calls. The confidence she displayed during the first confrontation at the gate was gone. She still defended the board's position, but the certainty had faded. Residents noticed. That mattered. Another hook. 3 days later, Walter received access to additional archive material. Not the entire authorization package. More pages had been approved for release. We met inside the county records office to review them. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled faintly of paper and copier toner. Outside, rainwater dripped from the courthouse gutters. Inside, decades of forgotten records waited in gray storage boxes. Mini hook. The newly released documents filled several folders. Engineering correspondence. Maintenance memorandums. Inspection summaries. Most were highly technical. Yet one pattern emerged almost immediately. Every major review focused on preserving the corridor's function, not preserving surrounding development, not protecting recreational facilities, protecting the corridor itself. Another hook. Walter highlighted references as we worked through the pages. Several mentioned future construction restrictions. Others referenced review requirements for structures extending into the route. One memorandum described concerns about unauthorized encroachment. The date caught my attention. It was written years after portions of the marina had already been expanded. Mini hook. We spent hours comparing dates against photographs and construction records. The timeline became clearer with every document. Original marina sections appeared older and closer to compliance. Later expansions were different. Those additions pushed farther into the corridor, far enough to raise questions, far enough to attract attention once measurements began. Another hook. Late that afternoon, the same field officer who initiated the surveys entered the records office. He carried a thick folder under one arm. Walter and I exchanged a quick glance. The officer rarely appeared without a reason. He joined us at the review table and opened the folder. Inside were preliminary assessment summaries based on recent survey data. Mini hook. The officer remained careful with his wording. Nothing had been finalized. No conclusions had been officially issued. Yet the measurements aligned closely with the historical records. More closely than anyone expected. Several structures appeared positioned directly within the protected route boundaries. Karen's board would eventually receive formal notice if the findings held. Another hook. Before leaving, the officer handed Walter a single copied page from a separate archive source. The page contained a reference number connected to the missing authorization package. One notation had been underlined decades earlier by an unknown reviewer. Walter read it once and looked up immediately. Someone had already raised concerns about the marina years before. The underlined notation changed the direction of the entire investigation. Outside the county records office, rainwater still dripped from the trees lining the parking lot. The air smelled clean and cool after the storm. Walter placed the copied page beside the historical diagrams and read the notation again. Somebody had questioned marina encroachment years earlier. Not recently. Not after my purchase. Years earlier. Mini hook. That meant the concerns were not new. Someone had already noticed the same conflict between the dock structures and the protected corridor. The question was what happened afterward. Did the review stop? Was it ignored? Or did the file simply disappear into storage where nobody followed up? Another hook. Walter immediately focused on the reference number printed beside the notation. Every government file leaves traces. Transfers. Reviews. Storage records. Cross. References. The number gave us a path to follow. He spent the next 2 hours contacting archive specialists and former agency staff. Most had retired years ago. A few still remembered pieces of the system. Mini hook. Late that afternoon, one retired records supervisor returned Walter's call. The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. I listened while Walter took notes across the margins of a legal pad. The supervisor remembered a review involving shoreline construction around a protected route. He did not remember every detail. He remembered one specific thing. The review was never fully resolved because documentation remained incomplete. Another hook. That statement hung in the air. Incomplete documentation. We had already seen missing permits, missing authorizations, missing records. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Walter thanked him and ended the call. Then he sat quietly for a moment looking across the table. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Nobody spoke. Mini hook. The next breakthrough arrived sooner than expected. 2 days later, archive personnel located an additional supplemental review package linked to the original authorization file. Unlike the earlier records, this package included field photographs, black and white images, survey stakes, shoreline measurements, construction progress markers. Decades old, yet remarkably clear. Another hook. Walter and I spread the photographs across a conference table at the records office. Several images showed the corridor before major marina expansion occurred. Others documented inspection visits after construction began. Then we found the image that stopped both of us. A survey flag stood exactly where one of the modern outer dock extensions now sat. The location matched perfectly. Mini hook. Walter compared the photograph to recent survey coordinates. The overlap was undeniable. The modern structure occupied space inspectors had specifically identified during prior reviews. That alone did not prove wrongdoing. It did prove something else. Earlier officials were aware of the corridor boundaries. Another hook. The deeper we examined the supplemental package, the clearer the timeline became. Initial construction appeared to remain outside critical sections. Later additions gradually pushed farther into the route. Expansion after expansion. Slip after slip. Small changes accumulated over time. Few people noticed because each modification looked minor by itself. Together they created a very different picture. Mini hook. News of the archive discoveries reached local officials quickly. Additional inquiries followed. Requests for construction histories. Permit records. Expansion approvals. Several departments became involved. Nothing dramatic happened publicly. No announcements. No headlines. Just a growing stack of questions requiring answers. Another hook. Around the lake, residents sensed the shift. Conversations became less emotional and more practical. People wanted facts now. Boat owners asked whether future access could be affected. Property owners asked about liability. Board members avoided speculation whenever possible. Even Karen seemed more cautious. The situation had moved beyond neighborhood arguments. Mini hook. A week after the supplemental package surfaced, Walter received a formal request to share portions of our findings with reviewing officials. We met again near the marina to organize the material. The weather had finally cleared. Sunlight sparkled across the water. The docks looked peaceful, almost innocent. Yet the records told a different story. Another hook. As we prepared copies of the diagrams, photographs, and survey data, Walter paused at one document buried near the back of the supplemental file. It was not highlighted, not underlined, easy to miss, yet it carried a handwritten note from a reviewer decades earlier. Walter read it silently. Then he handed it to me. The note referenced a pending determination that apparently was never completed. Someone had been waiting for a final decision. The handwritten note stayed on my mind during the entire drive back to the lake. Someone had been waiting for a final determination. Then the record trail stopped. No resolution. No closure. Just silence stretching across decades. The late afternoon sun reflected off the water as I pulled into the marina parking lot. The docks looked exactly the same as they had before this started. Yet nothing felt the same anymore. Mini hook. Walter arrived less than 20 minutes later carrying a new folder of correspondence obtained through the review process. We spread everything across a picnic table overlooking the shoreline. A warm breeze moved across the lake. Boat ropes creaked softly against cleats. Residents walked nearby pretending not to pay attention. Most of them were listening. Another hook. The newest documents revealed something important. After the original concern was raised, officials requested additional information before issuing a final determination. That request was documented clearly. What happened next was not. The file simply ended. No response package. No completed review. No final ruling. The process appeared frozen in time. Mini hook. Walter pointed out a critical detail. The request for information had been sent to a property management entity that no longer existed. Ownership changed several times afterward. Records moved. Boards changed. Contractors came and went. It became increasingly possible that the review never finished because nobody completed the required response. Another hook. If that theory proved correct, the implications were significant. Not because of punishment, not because of blame, because unresolved reviews do not magically disappear. They remain unresolved. The passage of time changes many things. It does not automatically answer unanswered questions. Mini hook. A few days later, the reviewing officials scheduled a formal findings meeting. Nothing dramatic. No courtroom. No television cameras. Just a conference room filled with maps, surveys, records, and people trying to understand what actually happened. The meeting was held inside a regional administrative office nearly an hour from the lake. Walter and I arrived early. Karen and several board representatives arrived shortly afterward. Another hook. The atmosphere felt different from previous encounters. The arguments were mostly gone. Documents had replaced opinions. Survey data had replaced assumptions. Everyone understood the discussion would focus on records rather than emotions. That shift alone spoke volumes about how far the situation had evolved. Mini hook. Officials began presenting preliminary findings. Large maps were displayed across screens. Survey measurements appeared beside historical diagrams. The protected corridor alignment matched almost perfectly across multiple generations of records. Every source pointed toward the same route through the lake. Consistency strengthened the findings considerably. Another hook. Then the discussion moved to construction history. Inspectors reviewed expansion phases of the marina. Early sections appeared less problematic. Later additions attracted greater attention. Several extensions reached directly into areas associated with the corridor. No final conclusions were announced yet, but the pattern was difficult to ignore. Mini hook. Karen listened quietly throughout most of the presentation. Occasionally, she reviewed notes with legal counsel seated beside her. Gone were the confident declarations from the first day at the gate. Gone were the assumptions that a simple ownership dispute would settle everything. The issue had become larger than any individual board member. Another hook. The most important moment arrived near the end of the meeting. An official summarized the status of the corridor itself. The historical designation remained supported by available records. The corridor's existence was no longer the primary question. The primary question now involved compatibility between existing structures and corridor protections. That distinction mattered enormously. Mini hook. As the meeting concluded, officials announced that a formal written assessment would be issued after final review of all collected materials. The room remained quiet. Everyone understood the significance. The next document would carry far more weight than anything released so far. Another hook. Outside the building, evening sunlight painted the clouds orange above the parking lot. Walter stood beside his truck reviewing the day's notes. Then his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen and immediately stopped talking. The message came from the archive office. They had finally located the last section of the authorization package. The message from the archive office arrived just as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Orange light faded across the horizon. The parking lot outside the administrative building was nearly empty. Walter read the notification once. Then again. The final section of the authorization package had been located and approved for release. After weeks of searching, the missing piece finally existed in front of us. Mini hook. We drove to the records office early the next morning. Fog hovered above the lake during the drive. The water looked calm and silver beneath the rising sun. Neither of us talked much. Too many questions remained unanswered. Yet for the first time, it felt like the answers might actually exist. Another hook. The archive package arrived in a sealed records container. Several staff members supervised the transfer. Every document was logged and cataloged. The process felt unusually formal. That alone suggested the material carried significance. Walter opened the file carefully. Decades-old pages rested inside protective sleeves. The paper had yellowed with age, but the text remained clear. Mini hook. The first documents contained engineering reviews we had never seen before. Route assessments. Navigation diagrams. Agency correspondence. Many details reinforced what we already knew. The corridor had remained recognized throughout the years. Officials repeatedly referenced its continuing importance. The consistency across decades was remarkable. Another hook. Then we reached the section everyone had been searching for. The unresolved determination referenced in the handwritten note. Walter immediately sat forward in his chair. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as he turned each page. The room felt unusually quiet. Even the archive staff seemed curious. Mini hook. The determination had been drafted but never finalized. That much became obvious quickly. Yet the draft contained extensive findings. Inspectors concluded that future shoreline development would require compatibility review before expanding into protected sections of the route. The language was direct, specific, difficult to misunderstand. Another hook. More importantly, the draft explained why the final determination never appeared. Supporting materials requested from responsible parties were never submitted. Without those materials, officials suspended the process pending additional information. The review remained open. Not denied. Not approved. Open. Decades later, that distinction still mattered. Mini hook. Walter highlighted several passages. Every one pointed toward the same conclusion. The corridor protections continued because the review had never reached closure. No document terminated the route. No document removed oversight. No document erased the underlying requirements. The administrative process simply stopped moving forward. Another hook. News of the findings reached reviewing officials almost immediately. Copies were requested. Supplemental analysis followed. Additional meetings were scheduled. The atmosphere around the lake changed again. Residents who once dismissed the issue now understood why the investigation had continued for so long. The records finally connected the missing pieces. Mini hook. A week later, preliminary conclusions began circulating among agencies involved in the review. Nothing had been officially released yet. However, the direction was becoming increasingly clear. Historical protections remained valid. The corridor remained recognized. Existing structures would need evaluation against those protections. Another hook. Karen requested a meeting with several residents and board representatives. The tone differed dramatically from earlier confrontations. There were no accusations, no demands, just difficult questions about what came next. Many homeowners worried about access. Others worried about costs. Some simply wanted certainty after months of uncertainty. Mini hook. I attended quietly and listened. The discussion focused on solutions rather than blame. That shift felt important. For the first time, people seemed more interested in resolving the problem than arguing about it. Walter later remarked that situations like this often improve once facts replace assumptions. Looking around the room, I realized he was right. Another hook. Days later, the formal written assessment was finally scheduled for release. Officials completed their reviews. Historical records had been analyzed. Survey measurements had been verified. Archive findings had been incorporated. Everything now pointed toward a final conclusion. The document everyone had been waiting for was ready. Another hook. On the evening before publication, I stood beside the shoreline watching sunlight shimmer across the lake. Boats rested quietly at their slips. Wind moved through the reeds along the water's edge. The entire conflict had started with a simple ownership dispute. Now it was about to end with something far larger. The final assessment would arrive the next morning. The formal assessment arrived just after sunrise. Mist hovered above the lake. The water reflected pale morning light across the Marina docks. I opened the document while standing near the shoreline where this entire conflict had begun. Weeks earlier, police vehicles had rolled onto the property because of a dispute nobody fully understood. Now every question had led to this moment. Mini hook. Walter arrived carrying coffee and a copy of the same assessment. Neither of us spoke immediately. We simply read. Page after page summarized the surveys, archive findings, historical reviews, construction timelines, and corridor documentation. Nothing inside felt dramatic. No emotional language. No accusations. Just facts carefully assembled over decades. Another hook. The conclusion appeared near the end. Historical protections remained valid. The corridor remained active. Multiple marina structures required review because they extended into areas subject to continuing navigation protections. Future access and operations would need to comply with those findings. The language was professional, measured, yet its impact spread through the community within hours. Many Hook residents gathered near the Marina office throughout the morning. Some carried printed copies of the assessment. Others relied on summaries circulating through neighborhood emails and phone calls. For the first time, nearly everyone was discussing the same set of facts. The uncertainty that fueled months of arguments had finally begun to disappear. Another Hook. Karen held a community meeting later that afternoon. The atmosphere felt completely different from the emergency gathering weeks earlier. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no demands for immediate action. Instead, homeowners wanted to understand the path forward. They asked practical questions: timelines, compliance options, future access arrangements. The conversation had matured. Minnie Hook. Karen addressed the community with a level of honesty many residents had not seen before. She acknowledged the findings. She acknowledged the unresolved historical reviews. Most importantly, she acknowledged that assumptions had guided too many decisions. Facts now had to lead the process. Several residents nodded quietly. Nobody celebrated. Nobody argued. They simply listened. Another Hook. Walter remained near the back of the room throughout the meeting. He never sought attention. He never tried to claim credit. Yet many residents approached him afterward. Some thanked him for preserving records that otherwise might have remained forgotten. Others thanked him for remaining patient while emotions ran high. Walter responded the same way each time. He simply said records matter. Minnie Hook. Over the following weeks, officials coordinated with property owners, engineers, and community representatives. Plans were developed. Reviews continued. Solutions emerged gradually, not through confrontation, through documentation, cooperation, and careful analysis. The process moved slower than many people wanted, yet it moved forward. That difference mattered. Another Hook. Standing beside the lake one evening, I watched workers inspect sections of the marina under clear blue skies. Boats drifted gently against their slips. Wind moved through the reeds. The same shoreline that once felt divided now felt calmer. Not perfect, but calmer. The tension that dominated the community had finally begun to fade. Minnie Hook. I thought back to the first day. The police call. The accusations. The assumptions about ownership and authority. None of those moments actually resolved anything. What changed the outcome were maps, surveys, archived records, forgotten files, small details, buried beneath years of routine decisions. Another Hook. The most surprising part was how close the truth had always been. The answers existed long before I arrived. Long before the arguments. Long before the surveys. They were sitting quietly inside storage boxes and archive systems waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Walter understood that from the beginning. Eventually, everyone else did too. Minnie Hook. As the sun set across Old Lake, golden reflections stretched across the water toward the marina. Residents walked the shoreline paths. Boats returned from evening outings. The lake looked peaceful again. Yet every time I glanced toward the corridor markers hidden beneath the water, I remembered how a single purchase uncovered decades of unanswered questions, and how patience, records, and persistence accomplished what arguments never could. Justice arrived one document at a time.